If this glimpse into Victorian London's frozen night stirred something in you, give the video a like. Subscribe for more journeys into the past, and tell me in the comments, would you have survived a winter back then? The divided city, winter descends on Victorian London in the 1800s, was a city that never slept, a metropolis swollen with industry, smoke, and human ambition. It was the beating heart of an empire, the crown jewel of Victorian progress. But when winter crept in, when frost coated the cobblestones and the fog thickened into ghostly curtains, the city revealed its darkest contrasts. On one side of town, glittering mansions gleamed in the warm glow of gaslight. Behind velvet curtains, the crackle of coal-fed fireplaces filled parlors with heat and laughter, and families dined on steaming roasts while children played in nurseries cocooned in quilts. Yet only a few streets away, in the labyrinth of East London slums, entire families huddled in one-room tenements, so cold that the walls sweated with damp and frost crept across broken windows like invading fingers of ice. For them, winter was not charming. It was not festive. It was a slow, grinding test of survival. The divide between rich and poor in Victorian London was never sharper than during those cold months. The wealthy could purchase warmth the way they purchased silks, carriages, and imported wines. Their coal cellars brimmed with fuel. Their wardrobes overflowed with thick wool, fur trims, and polished boots. Winter became an inconvenience, a backdrop for evening balls and glittering Christmas gatherings. But for the poor who made up the vast majority of London's millions, the season was merciless. The cold was not something to endure politely. It was something that invaded their homes, clung to their lungs, and gnawed at their bones. Step into a London street on a December evening in the 1850s, and you would feel this divide in the very air. In Mayfair, gas lamps glowed steadily, and carriage wheels rattled over cobbles slick with frost. Footmen in livery held open doors, bowing as fur-wrapped ladies swept inside to dine beneath chandeliers. A few miles east, however, in Whitechapel or Spitalfields, the same gas lamps flickered weakly in a haze of sulphurous fog, their glow swallowed almost immediately by smoke and soot. The alleys funneled icy winds between leaning brick buildings, and barefoot children darted through puddles edged with ice, their breaths clouding the night. In these streets the sound of laughter was rare. Instead came the hollow cough of a consumptive man, the wail of a hungry baby, the creak of wooden shutters rattling in the wind. For the poor, winter turned every day into an ordeal. Blankets were thin, often shared between 6 or 7 family members. The breath of sleepers rose in mist inside rooms colder than the street outside. Fires were rare, reserved for cooking if fuel could be bought at all. When coal was unaffordable, families scavenged for scraps of wood, broken crates, or even rags to burn, filling their homes with choking smoke for the sake of a little warmth. Disease followed swiftly in such conditions, creeping into lungs and settling in bones. And yet, amid the misery, there was resilience. Neighbors shared what little they had. Mothers sewed rags into makeshift mittens. Fathers patched boots with scraps of leather salvaged from workshop floors. Children huddled together in doorways, sharing body heat and even laughter when snow dusted the alleys. Survival in Victorian London was not just about enduring the cold. It was about enduring it together, with stubborn courage and ingenuity. The fog, too, was more than a backdrop. It became a character in the city's winter story. These infamous pea soupers could grow so thick that whole streets vanished into ghostly silence. Carriages crashed in the murk, and even lifelong Londoners lost their way in their own neighborhoods. The fog carried more than damp. It carried poison. Mixed with the smoke of thousands of coal fires, it turned the air into a choking haze of sulphur and ash. Curtains yellowed, clothing browned, and lungs blackened. To breathe in Victorian London in winter was to inhale disease itself. But the city did not pause. Commerce, labor, and daily life continued despite the fog and frost. Horse hooves clattered on icy cobblestones. Street sweepers scraped at frozen muck, and vendors shouted into the gloom in hopes of selling roasted chestnuts or cheap matches. London was alive even in the coldest nights, a city stubbornly refusing to stop, even when the elements seemed determined to break it. Winter was not merely a season. It was a mirror that reflected London's true self, its wealth and inequality, its progress and neglect, its cruelty and its compassion. Behind every glowing window was a family shielded by money. and behind every darkened alley was another family fighting just to see the spring. The season revealed the brutal divide more starkly than any statistic could, and so when the winds howled down the narrow lanes and the frost painted every window pane, London stood as a city of contradictions. It was at once magnificent and miserable, splendid and squalid. For the rich, winter was a scene to be decorated, a backdrop for celebration. For the poor, it was a battleground where each day survived was a victory in itself. This was Victorian London in winter, harsh, unrelenting, unforgettable. The enemy called weather. If one wished to understand why winter in Victorian London was so feared, one only needed to step outside on a damp January morning. The air did not simply feel cold. It felt alive, as though it crept through seams, slipped under collars, and burrowed straight into the marrow of your bones. It was a wet cold, the kind that clung to skin like a second layer and refused to let go. Unlike the crisp winters of northern Europe or the dry chill of the American plains, London's winter was an enemy wrapped in fog, mist, and unrelenting dampness. The city sat in a basin of smoke and water. The River Thames ran thick and sluggish, exhaling mist into the streets. Thousands of chimneys belched soot into the sky, filling the clouds until they sagged heavy with filth. The result was the infamous pea soup fog, a yellow-brown curtain that could swallow whole buildings in its folds. Within it, sound was muffled, shapes blurred, and life itself seemed to shrink to the span of an arm's reach. A man could leave his doorstep for the market and vanish into that fog, only to stumble home hours later, eyes streaming, lungs burning, clothes stiff with damp. The fog was more than an inconvenience. It was deadly. Horses spooked and bolted in the unseen streets, their hooves clattering in panic, often sending carriages toppling into ditches or colliding with unseen obstacles. Lampposts became sudden hazards, looming out of the murk too late to avoid. Criminals thrived in the pea soupers, using the blindness of the city as their shield. Pickpockets slipped through crowds, thieves snatched purses and disappeared into the vapor, and sometimes bodies were found days later in alleyways, lives snuffed out by hands unseen. Snow, though less common in London than in northern counties, carried its own dangers. When it fell, it blanketed the city not in silence but in paralysis. Roads grew impassable, carts skidded and commerce slowed to a crawl. Yet for the wealthy, snow meant sleigh rides in Hyde Park, children in fur-lined boots pulling sledges across private gardens, and the sparkle of frost on glass conservatories. For the poor, snow meant disaster. The flimsy roofs of slum dwellings groaned under its weight. Icy water seeped through cracks, and the cold grew unbearable when windows were stuffed only with rags and newspaper. In alleys where chimney sweeps and matchgirls lived, snow did not fall softly. It became a death sentence, pressing upon the weak until bodies lay stiff in doorways. And then there was the wind, sharp, merciless, and without compassion. It tore through narrow lanes, howling past crooked chimneys, rattling shutters, and extinguishing the small, fragile flames of tallow candles. In grander homes, wind was a nuisance that rattled window panes, until servants closed shutters and drew thick curtains. In the East End, the wind was a predator, sneaking beneath floorboards, driving smoke back into rooms, and piercing the patched coats of beggars. Children huddled together like sparrows, faces pressed into one another's shoulders as the wind stole their warmth. For those forced to work outside, the weather was a torment. Dock workers at the riverfront battled both ice and fog, often unable to see the ships they unloaded. Road sweepers froze as they scraped snow into piles, only for carts to scatter it again. Policemen patrolled blindly, their whistles echoing into emptiness, hoping that somewhere someone might hear. For the poor, the weather dictated not only comfort, but survival. A day too cold to beg, too foggy to sell wares, or too icy to carry water, meant a day without food. The dampness of London's winters was the great equalizer, in theory at least, because it spared no building, no garment, no human lung, but the difference between rich and poor determined whether dampness was a nuisance or a killer. In Kensington mansions, the smell of wet wool was something shrugged off by servants tasked with drying coats near the kitchen hearth. In Whitechapel, damp meant disease. Chilblains swelling on fingers, pneumonia creeping into lungs, tuberculosis lingering in every cough. A single wet night could condemn a child to a grave before spring. Worse still, the fog was laced with poison. Coal smoke thickened the air until it became not just heavy, but caustic. Residents complained of throats burning, eyes streaming, and lungs rasping with every breath. Doctors warned of fog fevers and smoke diseases, though little could be done beyond resting indoors, which for the poor meant crouching in a room just as smoke-filled as the street. The city's progress, its mighty chimneys and endless furnaces, had turned the very air into a weapon, and yet London carried on. The clop of hooves never ceased entirely, nor did the shouts of street vendors trying to sell roasted chestnuts, penny pies, or matches through the fog. Life persisted, even as the weather waged war on the city. To outsiders, London seemed unconquerable. To those who lived there, each winter was a battle, and the weather was a relentless foe. The season's cruelty lay not only in its chill, but in its persistence. Cold mornings blurred into icy nights. Weeks passed without the sun piercing the haze. Each breath of damp, soot-choked air carried the promise of illness, and each night without warmth brought the possibility of death. The weather was not just a backdrop to Victorian London's story. It was its most implacable enemy, impartial yet devastating, pressing hardest against those least able to resist. In this way, winter in Victorian London was more than a season. It was a siege, and the city's poorest citizens faced it unarmed. The battle for coal and fire of winter was an enemy. Then fire was the only defense. In Victorian London, survival could be measured not in pounds or shillings, but in lumps of coal. Coal was the city's lifeblood, its currency of warmth, the difference between comfort and despair. Every breath of smoke curling from a chimney told a story of survival. And every hearth gone cold meant danger, hunger, or death. The wealthy never thought much about coal. For them it arrived by the ton, carted in by delivery men and shoveled neatly into cellars the size of cottages. A grand home might keep several fireplaces alight at once, one in the dining room for warmth at meals, another in the parlour for guests, one in the study where the master read the Times, and several more in bedrooms to ensure the family never woke to icy sheets. Servants rose before dawn to coax those fires back to life, so that by the time their employers stirred from feather beds, the rooms already glowed with heat. For the upper classes, coal was background luxury, no more thought of than the silver cutlery or the gas lamps overhead. But for the poor, coal was obsession. Every morning began with the same question: could they afford a shovelful that day? Coal was sold by weight, and the smallest measure, a scuttle or a bucketful, cost pennies that many did not have. Families stretched their coins thin, buying just enough to heat a pot of broth or keep a single room warm for a few hours. When the coal ran out, they turned to desperate measures. Children were sent to pick up slack. The crumbs of coal dropped from carts onto the streets. Men scavenged through ash heaps, searching for unburnt lumps overlooked by others. Women begged from merchants, offering labor or scraps in return for fuel. In slums, the smell of burning was not always coal. Families fed their fires with broken furniture, scraps of wood, even torn clothing too ragged to mend. Old shoes, straw from mattresses, and refuse collected from the streets became makeshift fuel. The smoke from such fires choked and stung, filling rooms with a bitter haze, but smoke was preferable to frost. Better to cough through the night than to wake to frozen fingers. The demand for coal made it a cruel economy. Merchants sold it at inflated prices in winter, knowing desperation gave them power. On the coldest nights, fights broke out in coal yards as families competed for the last scraps. Children carried coal in sacks slung over thin shoulders, their faces blackened, their hands raw and bleeding from the jagged edges of the lumps. Entire neighborhoods stank of coal smoke, yet inside many homes the hearths remained cold. In wealthier parts of the city, coal became a symbol of indulgence. Glowing grates cast cheerful light onto velvet curtains and polished furniture. The clinking of tongs, the crackle of flames, the sigh of a fire being stirred, all were sounds of comfort. Guests warmed themselves without thought of the cost, sipping hot drinks while frost etched delicate patterns on windows outside. In these rooms, fire was aesthetic as much as necessity, a flickering backdrop to conversation and laughter. In poorer quarters, fire was not background, it was center stage. Families crowded close to the grate, stretching hands toward meager flames. Children lay on the hearthstone, their faces pink from the heat, trying to soak in warmth before the embers died. A single log or lump of coal could mean an evening of relative comfort, or a night of shivering. Arguments erupted over whether to burn fuel now or save it for the colder hours before dawn. Mothers often chose to starve fires to save for cooking, forcing families to wrap themselves in rags until morning. Coal thieves prowled the streets too. Sacks disappeared from doorsteps, shovelfuls vanished from carts. It was a crime despised by the wealthy, but often forgiven among the poor, for all knew the thief had likely stolen for warmth, not profit. Some chimney sweeps, children small enough to wriggle through soot-choked flues, pocketed handfuls of coal as they worked, smuggling them home to families who desperately needed fuel. And then there were the homeless, those with no hearth at all. For them, fire was a fleeting blessing found only in public places, a bonfire in the street, a lantern near a work site, or the kindness of a stranger who allowed them to linger by a grate. At night they huddled together in doorways, covering themselves in sacks, newspapers, or straw. Some tried to sleep near bakeries, where the ovens radiated faint warmth through walls. Others pressed close to the bodies of horses in stables, sharing animal heat in the dark. But many did not wake at all. A frozen body in the morning gutter was not uncommon, a silent testament to the absence of fire. Coal was more than fuel. It was survival, class distinction, and sometimes the cause of death. Its smoke painted the sky, choked the lungs, and blackened the walls of every building. But without it, the city would have frozen. For the poor, each day was a negotiation with coal. How much to buy, how long it would last, whether it was better spent on warmth or on cooking. For the rich, it was simply another resource managed by servants, invisible yet ever-present. In the end, fire in Victorian London was not merely warmth, it was a measure of life itself. To sit before a roaring grate was to feel safe, secure, and even powerful. To stare into a cold hearth was to know hunger, sickness, and fear. And so every winter night, across that sprawling city, the battle for coal and fire played out again and again, a struggle as relentless as the cold itself. Clothing. The thin armor if fire was a fortress against winter, then clothing was its outer wall. In Victorian London, what you wore in the cold season revealed everything about who you were, and often determined whether you survived to see spring. Cloth and wool, leather and fur, threadbare rags and patched boots, these were not just garments, they were shields, fragile or strong, against a season that had no mercy. For the wealthy, winter clothing was a statement as much as a necessity. Ladies of Mayfair emerged, wrapped in layers of velvet cloaks trimmed with fur, their gloved hands resting on the arms of gentlemen dressed in heavy wool coats lined with silk. Hats were high, bonnets wide-brimmed, and every ensemble layered with crinolines, petticoats, and finely woven stockings. Servants draped shawls around their shoulders and carried parasols even in the cold, a strange token of fashion in a season when survival seemed more pressing than elegance. Men of wealth sported greatcoats with tall collars, buttoned snugly against the damp wind, and polished boots that clicked confidently across frozen streets. Their attire was not only warm, but also designed to project authority, stability, and superiority. The wealthy faced winter with fabrics that whispered luxury, even as snow drifted on their sleeves. For the poor, clothing was a daily battle. A single coat might be shared between family members, passed from father to son depending on who braved the streets that day. Trousers were patched until the fabric was more stitch than cloth, seams bursting with strain. Children wrapped their feet in rags or newspapers, stuffing them into broken boots or walking barefoot on icy stones. Shawls and scarves were made from scraps, dyed with soot and grime, never enough to keep the chill from gnawing at their necks. Gloves were rare treasures. More often, hands were left raw, cracked, and bleeding from the cold. The dampness made matters worse. Even the thickest garments became heavy with mist, soaking through to skin and never fully drying in airless tenements. Poor families hung clothes near sputtering fires, hoping the steam would evaporate, but often the heat was too little. Damp clothing clung to bodies like ice, drawing sickness deep into lungs. It was not uncommon to see children in slums, shivering in shirts so thin they seemed translucent against pale skin. Their breath puffed white in alleys, while their little hands, red and swollen, clutched baskets of matches or newspapers for sale. Meanwhile, in the homes of the wealthy, clothing was changed frequently. Day clothes for promenading, evening attire for dinners, nightgowns thick with embroidery for sleeping in heated chambers. A wealthy woman might have fur stoles, muffs to warm her hands and fashionable bonnets lined with velvet. Her wardrobe was an arsenal against cold, each garment a polished weapon. Yet even in warmth fashion ruled. Women's skirts dragged across snowy streets, soaking hems that servants rushed to dry and clean, while men's polished shoes sometimes slipped on ice, more concerned with appearance than practicality. Among the poor, practicality was everything. Old army coats sold second-hand in markets became prized possessions. Shawls passed down for generations carried the smell of smoke and sweat but gave a hint of warmth. Mothers wrapped infants in layers of cloth scraps, sometimes swaddling them so tightly they could hardly move, hoping to trap what little body heat they had. Entire families often slept in their day clothes, curling together in bed to survive long nights. In the morning, they woke with garments stiff with frost, thawed only by their own breath. Clothing also carried the stigma of poverty. Employers judged laborers by the state of their coats. Landlords eyed tenants with suspicion if their boots were worn thin. And policemen were quicker to stop and search those whose garments marked them as destitute. A patched sleeve was more than a sign of hardship. It was a target, drawing the city's prejudice. Children in rags were assumed to be thieves, women with torn shawls suspected of vice. The poor wore not just clothes, but the burden of class, visible to every eye. Yet within these garments of struggle there was resourcefulness. Women reworked dresses into coats, cut blankets into makeshift cloaks, and unraveled old knitwear to re-stitch new scarves. Men lined boots with straw, replaced missing buttons with string and stuffed paper into gaps to block the wind. Even children became inventive, tying rags into socks or creating games to distract themselves from the biting cold. Clothing might have been inadequate, but it was never without ingenuity. Still, no amount of patching could disguise the gulf between rich and poor. On the same street, one might pass a gentleman in a gleaming top hat and a shivering boy in trousers, too short for his thin legs. One stepped confidently toward a carriage, the other trudged toward a day's begging, the frost crunching under bare feet. Their clothing told the story of their fates before a single word was spoken, and so winter in Victorian London was fought on two fronts, inside the home with fire and outside with clothing. The wealthy dressed as if the season were merely a canvas for fashion, their warmth purchased with silks and furs. The poor wrapped themselves in whatever scraps they could find, their armor against the cold no more than thin rags. Every coat, every shawl, every patched boot was a shield, fragile, worn, but desperately needed. Clothing was not just fabric, it was survival stitched together with threadbare hope. Food and hunger in the frost in Victorian London, food was more than nourishment. It was survival, hope, and sometimes a bitter reminder of inequality. Winter magnified this truth, stripping away the abundance of autumn and replacing it with scarcity. The contrast between what the rich dined upon and what the poor subsisted on could not have been sharper. Inside the grand homes of Belgravia and Kensington, the dining tables groaned with abundance. Roasted meats, beef, goose, and pheasant, were carved by footmen in crisp uniforms. Platters of vegetables, puddings dripping with suet, and steaming bowls of soup filled the air with rich aromas. Wine sparkled in crystal glasses. Even when snow fell and fog suffocated the streets, these families ate lavishly, warmed by the fires of prosperity. For them, winter meant feasting, especially during Christmas, when tables overflowed with mince pies, plum pudding, and oranges imported at great cost. But in the East End, meals were meager. Families lined up at bakeries for stale bread sold at a discount. Potatoes were boiled into thin soups, sometimes flavored only with salt if meat was too costly. A piece of bacon fat, if it could be afforded, might be saved and reused multiple times to grease pans or add flavor to broth. For children, dinner was often nothing more than a crust of bread or a ladle of watery gruel. The hunger gnawed sharp as the winter wind, and malnutrition weakened bodies already under siege from the cold. Street vendors sold cheap foods, roasted chestnuts, hot eels in thick sauce, and penny pies filled with questionable fillings. These were both meals and survival strategies for the poor, something warm in the belly, however small. Roasted chestnuts sold in paper cones were not only a rare treat, but also served as makeshift hand warmers in the biting cold. Children pressed them into their palms before daring to eat them. The wealthy spoke of seasonal delicacies. The poor spoke of hunger. In middle-class homes, Families enjoyed boiled puddings, beef stews, and toasted bread with butter. In the rookeries of Whitechapel, children picked through refuse heaps for scraps. Some gnawed bones thrown away by butchers, still clinging with fat or gristle. Dogs and humans competed in the same alleys for discarded food. Alcohol, especially gin, became both a curse and a comfort. For the poorest, it was a cheap way to dull hunger and warm the body, if only temporarily. Gin shops glowed invitingly on street corners, their doors swinging constantly as men and women stumbled in from the frost. Mothers, desperate and exhausted, sometimes gave their children a sip to quiet their cries. Yet the warmth of gin was false, leaving bodies weaker, colder, and more vulnerable. It was survival borrowed at the cost of tomorrow. Food scarcity was not just about poverty. It was about availability. Harsh winters sometimes froze transport along the Thames, or made roads impassable, cutting off supplies. Bread riots were not unheard of when prices spiked, and bakers feared angry crowds demanding cheaper loaves. In these moments, the desperation of hunger revealed itself in full, and London's veneer of civility cracked. Yet even amid hunger, communities tried to share. A pot of stew might stretch across several families. Neighbours swapped scraps, a potato for a slice of bread, or pooled pennies to buy a joint of meat for a rare Sunday feast. Charitable kitchens, often run by churches, doled out bowls of soup, but the lines were endless and supplies rarely enough. For the poor, hunger was constant, as much a part of winter as fog and frost. For the rich, food was another comfort to be enjoyed in excess. And in between these extremes, the middle classes balanced carefully, fearful of falling into want, yet unable to reach the heights of luxury. Winter meals in Victorian London were therefore not just about sustenance. They were about status, survival, and sacrifice. A roasted goose might represent prosperity, a crust of bread, endurance. Hunger was the silent companion of the poor, following them through alleys and into bed, gnawing long after the fires had died. Shelter from the storm clothing and food were essential, but without shelter, survival in London's winters was nearly impossible. The city was a patchwork of homes, mansions, modest terraces, crumbling tenements, and makeshift huts. In winter, those differences became a matter of life and death. For the wealthy, shelter was comfort perfected. Their homes were built of solid brick, their windows double-glazed or shuttered against drafts. Heavy curtains kept warmth inside, and carpets covered every floor. Fires burned in multiple rooms, filling hallways with heat and light. Bedrooms were piled with quilts and feather beds. Even the servants, though less comfortable, had some refuge in attics or kitchens warmed by stoves. To live in such a house was to feel winter only at a distance, a passing season glimpsed through frosted glass. For the poor, shelter was fragile, often more symbolic than real. Tenement housing in London's East End crammed entire families into single rooms. Walls dripped with damp. Roofs leaked. Windows were stuffed with rags or paper to keep out the wind. Floors were bare and cold, sometimes little more than packed earth. Families slept side by side for warmth, their breaths rising into the stale air. Water seeped through cracks, and frost formed inside as readily as out. For many, rent consumed nearly every penny, leaving little for coal or food. Slum landlords charged dearly for rooms that were unfit for animals, yet tenants had no choice. Those who could not pay slept in lodging houses, where a penny bought a place on a bench and 2 pennies earned a spot on the floor. In such rooms, dozens of strangers slept pressed together, their coughs and snores echoing through the night. The smell of unwashed bodies, smoke and mildew choked the air. The homeless fared worst of all. They crowded beneath bridges into stairwells, or huddled against shop fronts until police drove them away. Many slept in parks or along the banks of the Thames, wrapping themselves in newspapers that crackled like frost. Some sought warmth in railway stations, though guards often forced them back into the cold. Death from exposure was a constant threat, and in the morning it was not unusual to find bodies stiff in alleys. Charity offered some relief. Churches opened their doors on the coldest nights, and shelters handed out straw for bedding. Yet these measures were inadequate for the thousands without proper homes. The dreaded workhouse was often the last refuge, its walls cold and unwelcoming. Families who entered were split apart, men to one ward, women to another, children separated. For many, the shame of the workhouse was worse than the streets. Shelter was thus more than a roof. It was dignity, privacy, and protection. For the rich, it was guaranteed. For the poor, it was fragile, conditional, and often denied. Winter revealed this inequality most cruelly. As snow fell on rooftops, it lay as decoration on mansions and as condemnation on tenements. Even in the depths of winter, London never stopped working. Commerce hummed, factories smoked, and ships unloaded at the docks. For the wealthy, winter was an inconvenience to be endured with comfort. For the poor, it was a test of endurance played out in the streets, workshops and markets. Men rose before dawn, trudging through frost to the docks, where icy ropes stiffened in their hands and crates froze to the ground. Labourers strained under loads that cut into numb shoulders, while the fog hid dangers and accidents multiplied. Builders worked on scaffolding slick with ice, their boots slipping on beams. For them, each day was a gamble between wages earned and injuries sustained. Women bore their own burdens. Washerwomen bent over basins of freezing water, their hands raw and red, clothes stiff with frost before they dried. Seamstresses hunched in unheated workshops, their breath clouding as they stitched until their fingers bled. Flower sellers stood on street corners, petals wilting in the cold, their own bodies shivering beneath thin shawls. Work was relentless, for to stop was to starve. Children were not spared. Chimney sweeps crawled through soot-blackened flues, lungs filling with dust while their bare feet froze on rooftops. Matchgirls carried boxes through the fog, their lips blue, their coughs rattling. Bootblacks crouched in icy alleys, scrubbing shoes with stiff fingers. For many children, work was the only barrier between their families and destitution. The middle classes fared somewhat better. Clerks and shopkeepers worked indoors, though unheated offices still numbed their hands. Teachers lectured in drafty schoolrooms, and apprentices laboured in workshops. Their lives were not easy, but they were shielded from the worst of the cold. For all classes, winter increased risks. Accidents rose, illnesses spread, and exhaustion grew heavier with every day. But the poor bore the brunt. Their wages barely stretched to cover food, let alone fuel or clothing. A single missed day could mean eviction, hunger, or worse, and so the poor worked on, bending beneath winter's weight. They laboured not for prosperity, but for survival, driven by necessity, fueled by hunger and punished by cold. In this way, work itself became both salvation and torment, the thin line between enduring the winter and being consumed by it. Disease in the frostive hunger and cold weren't enough. Victorian Londoners also battled an invisible enemy every winter: disease. The city, already suffocating under coal smoke and overcrowded tenements, became a breeding ground for sickness once the frost set in. Winter did not kill germs, it trapped them, encouraging their spread in damp, unventilated rooms where the poor huddled together for warmth. Respiratory illnesses were the fiercest killers. Pneumonia swept through families in single-room dwellings where parents, children, and even boarders slept side by side, breathing the same cold air. Bronchitis and tuberculosis, known grimly as consumption, tightened their grip in winter. The damp cold seeped into lungs, and coughs became the music of slum alleys, echoing through walls thin as paper. Children wasted away, their cheeks hollowed, their chests rattling at night while exhausted mothers pressed cloths to their foreheads. The infamous London fogs only worsened matters. These pea soupers weren't merely inconvenient mists. They were toxic clouds of soot, ash and sulphur from thousands of chimneys. Breathing them in was like inhaling smoke from a furnace. Strong men staggered in the streets, their throats raw and their eyes streaming. The poor, already weakened by hunger, collapsed in coughing fits that often marked the beginning of their end. Doctors coined the vague term fog fever for the ailments that claimed lives in such conditions, but treatment was scarce. The homeless suffered most cruelly. Without shelter, their bodies froze while disease crept silently through their veins. Exposure left them vulnerable to frostbite and hypothermia, which in turn weakened the immune system. It was not unusual for constables to find stiffened corpses under bridges or in alleys, the victims of both cold and sickness. Death certificates might list exposure or consumption, but poverty was always the true cause. Even those with homes were not safe. Damp, mouldy walls became breeding grounds for infection. Water leaks, unwashed bedding, and overcrowded tenements turned illness into wildfire. Measles, influenza, and whooping cough tore through families, sometimes wiping out entire households in the course of a single season. Workhouses, grim as they were, only intensified the spread. Hundreds of desperate souls crammed into poorly ventilated halls, coughing and wheezing in unison, their weakened bodies unable to fight back. For the wealthy, disease was a danger but rarely a death sentence. Doctors made house calls, carrying leather bags filled with tinctures, tonics, and poultices. Warm fires and proper diets gave their patients strength to recover. Children in nurseries were shielded with warm beds, fresh milk, and attentive care. Illness visited these homes, but recovery was possible. Among the poor, by contrast, even a simple cold might become fatal. In winter, disease was not an exception. It was expected. Death tolls spiked each year as lungs filled with fluid and fevers burned in damp, unheated rooms. The season magnified the city's inequalities. The rich sneezed and recovered. The poor coughed and died. Hand still, Londoners rose each day to face the frost, even as sickness claimed their neighbours, friends, and children. Disease was as much a part of Victorian winter as the fog itself, silent, relentless, and merciless. Children in the cold of all the souls in Victorian London, none bore winter's cruelty more harshly than the children. They were the smallest, the weakest, and the least prepared for the relentless hardships of the season. Their suffering was visible on every street corner, in every alley, in every graveyard where tiny markers multiplied once frost descended. In wealthy households, childhood was a protected season. Sons and daughters of bankers, merchants, and professionals wore wool coats trimmed with fur, thick stockings and leather boots that kept their feet dry. Their nurseries glowed with fires tended by servants, and their games continued indoors when the fog grew too thick outside. Snow became a novelty, a chance to build snowmen in gardens or skate on frozen ponds. Christmas was magical. Toys, sweets, and family gatherings. For them, winter was not a danger, but a backdrop to joy. In the slums, it was another world entirely. Many poor children owned no shoes, trudging barefoot through icy puddles, their toes purple with frost. Their clothes were little more than patched rags, layered until fabric ran out. Snow did not mean play. It meant pain, hunger, and sickness. Instead of games, they scavenged along the frozen banks of the Thames, searching for driftwood or lumps of coal fallen from barges. Their small hands shivered as they picked through ash heaps, hoping to find scraps still warm enough to carry home. Work made winter harsher still. Boys known as mudlarks searched the icy riverbanks for anything to sell, bits of rope, scraps of iron, or coal washed ashore. Chimney sweeps, often no older than 8, climbed soot-blackened flues, lungs filling with dust while the frost cut their skin. Match girls walked miles through the fog, their boxes heavy, their shawls too thin. Many fell ill from the chemicals they handled daily, their pale faces glowing faintly in the gaslight. Hunger gnawed constantly. Children's small bodies burned energy quickly, yet their diets rarely offered enough to keep them warm. Potatoes, bread, and thin gruel did little to strengthen them against frost. Malnutrition made them fragile, and colds swiftly turned into pneumonia. Infant mortality soared in winter. Mothers awoke to find their babies still and cold beside them, the frost claiming lives silently in the night. Yet children also carried resilience. They huddled together for warmth, shared scraps of bread, and even laughed in fleeting moments. A snowball fight in the alleys, a roasted chestnut bought with a precious penny, or the rare kindness of a passerby could light up their eyes. Their innocence endured even in misery, a fragile flame refusing to be extinguished. But the divide was unmissable. Wealthy children skated and sang carols, while poor children froze and begged. Winter revealed Victorian society's divisions most starkly through its children. Some grew up with memories of joy. Others carried scars, physical and emotional, that lasted their entire lives. Childhood in Victorian winter was not a universal season of wonder. It was for many a season of survival. Women's silent burden winter in Victorian London pressed heavily on women. Whether they were mothers in slums, seamstresses in workshops, or even ladies of wealthy homes, the season demanded more of them than of men. They carried burdens both visible and invisible, shouldering survival itself for their families. For middle and upper-class women, winter posed inconvenience but not threat. They wore silks layered with furs, hosted gatherings in firelit parlours, and attended theatres and balls in carriages. Servants lit their fires, prepared their meals, and managed their households. Their hardships were softened by privilege, and their role was often one of charity, donating coal, sewing blankets, or organizing food drives for the poor. Though these efforts mattered, they did not expose wealthy women to frost and hunger in the way that poor women endured daily. Working class and poor women bore the brunt of winter's cruelty. Mothers rationed food so that children could eat, often going hungry themselves. They tore apart shawls to wrap infants, patched clothing until no fabric remained, and coaxed weak fires to life from scraps of wood. Their choices were constant sacrifices, coal or bread, warmth or dignity, their hunger against their child's survival. Women in labor faced double suffering. Laundresses worked with freezing water, hands cracked and bleeding as they scrubbed garments for wealthier families. Seamstresses bent over sewing machines in cold, dim rooms, their fingers stiff as they stitched until midnight. Street sellers hawked flowers, matches, or trinkets in sleet and fog, sometimes carrying infants in their arms while begging for customers. Collapse from exhaustion was common, yet the alternative was starvation. Some women, with no options left, turned to prostitution. The cold months drove thousands onto the streets, their shawls soaked, their lips blue, their bodies offered for enough pennies to buy a meal or a night's lodging. It was a cruel economy of desperation, judged harshly by society but born of necessity. Many were young, some mere children, forced into choices that left lifelong scars. And yet women also embodied resilience. They were the first to rise, lighting fires or fetching water before dawn. They were the last to rest, patching clothes or preparing meals by candlelight. They comforted sick children, supported ailing husbands, and buried the dead, only to rise again the next morning. Their endurance was rarely recognized, but it was the backbone of survival in London's poorest quarters. Winter revealed women's strength more than any other season. They bore the silent burden of keeping life alive, holding families together through hunger, frost, and despair. History often overlooked them, but without their sacrifices, countless families would never have survived the brutal winters of Victorian London. The homeless in winter. If poverty made winter cruel, homelessness made it lethal. In Victorian London, thousands faced each winter with no roof, no bed, and no fire. For them, the cold was not a season to endure but a daily adversary that claimed lives silently. Night after night, the homeless of London slept where they could, under the arches of railway bridges, in the shadows of shop doorways, along the frozen banks of the Thames. Their bedding was rags, sacks, or newspapers wrapped tightly against bodies. The fortunate managed to scavenge old blankets, though dampness often made them heavier than helpful. In the mornings, constables routinely discovered corpses stiffened by frost, men, women, even children who had not survived the night. Public shelters existed, but they were pitifully few. Those who managed to enter found themselves packed shoulder to shoulder in drafty halls. A hard bench or patch of floor was the only relief offered. Fires, if lit, were small and weak, unable to warm so many bodies. The air inside was thick with coughs, sweat, and the sour stench of unwashed clothes. Yet even this misery was better than sleeping on bare stone. Workhouses offered another form of shelter, but at a heavy price. To enter meant humiliation, separation from family, grueling labor, and the loss of dignity. Men were sent one way, women another, children to their own wards. Families desperate enough to accept these terms did so, knowing they might never again share the same bed or table. Many chose the streets over this enforced cruelty, even at the risk of death. Children without homes were the most pitiful sight. Orphans and runaways huddled together beneath bridges, their small bodies trembling as they shared scraps of bread. Some joined gangs for protection, while others begged on corners with voices weakened by hunger. A penny tossed by a passerby could mean food, or a night in a lodging house. Without it, the child returned to the cold, sometimes never to rise again. The wealthy encountered these figures on their carriage rides through the city, ragged bundles huddled in doorways, hands trembling as they reached out. Some offered coins or food stirred by pity. Others turned away in disgust, unwilling to acknowledge the suffering at their feet. Winter revealed this divide mercilessly. In one part of the city, a family dined on roast goose beneath chandeliers. In another, a child froze beneath a railway arch. The homeless endured winter with little more than scraps of will. Each frostbitten hand, each empty belly, each body stiffened in the morning shadows told the same story. Survival was not guaranteed. In Victorian London, homelessness during winter was more than hardship. It was a death sentence written in ice and fog. The workhouse in winter-few institutions symbolized Victorian poverty more starkly than the workhouse, and in winter their role became even more pronounced. For the destitute, they offered food, shelter, and fire, But they were also prisons of discipline, shame, and despair. The Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 had created a system designed to discourage dependence on charity. Relief was available, but only inside the workhouse. Conditions were made deliberately harsh so that only the truly desperate would enter. Winter, with its hunger and frost, drove thousands to that threshold. On freezing nights, long lines formed outside the gates. Men, women, and children shivered in rags, begging admittance. Some were turned away if the halls were already full. Those who entered faced immediate separation, families torn apart at the door. Husbands and wives were divided. Parents were parted from children. The warmth of kinship was replaced by cold stone walls and rigid rules. Inside, the relief was minimal. Fires burned sparingly, their heat lost in high-ceilinged halls. Dormitories were cold, blankets thin, and drafts constant. Food was meager, bowls of gruel, bread, sometimes a piece of cheese or broth. It was regular at least, but designed to sustain, not to nourish. Hunger lingered even within the walls. The cost of shelter was labor. Men broke stones, picked oakum, or toiled in icy yards until their fingers bled. Women scrubbed floors, washed laundry in freezing basins, or stitched garments until their hands stiffened. Even children were set to tasks, carrying loads, picking fibers, or sweeping halls. Their small bodies labored as if they were adults. Illness spread quickly in these crowded halls. A single cough echoed into a chorus. Winter colds became pneumonia. Weakened bodies succumbed to fever. Death inside the workhouse was common, and the institution became for many less a refuge than a waiting room for the grave. And yet, for all its cruelty, the workhouse was often the only barrier between survival and death. Families who resisted entering out of pride often gave in when hunger and frost became unbearable. The choice was stark: freeze outside or endure humiliation within. To lawmakers and reformers, the system was practical, a way to provide aid without encouraging idleness. To the poor who lived it, it was a punishment for poverty itself. In winter, the workhouse revealed the harshest paradox of Victorian charity. Help was given, but only after dignity was stripped away. It was both shield and sentence, survival wrapped in despair. Streets of struggle. The streets of Victorian London were always alive with noise and movement, but in winter, they transformed into stages of suffering and survival. Frost, fog, and hardship played their cruelest parts along cobbled roads where the poor lived, worked, and begged. Imagine stepping out on a winter morning. The air hits first, heavy with coal smoke, yellowed by fog clinging to skin and lungs. Street lamps glow faintly, their halos swallowed by the haze. Cobblestones are slick with slush and ice, horses struggling to find footing as carts creak under loads. Carriages loom suddenly out of the mist, wheels splashing freezing water onto pedestrians. Collisions are common, cries of alarm echoing in the gloom. For the poor, the streets were both workplace and home. Vendors called out through the fog, "Hot chestnuts," "fresh pies." Their voices strained against the muffled air, desperate to be heard. Women stood with baskets of matches or flowers, their shawls soaked through, their babies wrapped in rags at their chests. Children hawked newspapers, shouting headlines into the mist. Each coin earned was a victory against hunger. Beggars huddled in doorways, hands trembling as they reached out. Some passers-by spared a penny. Others averted their eyes, eager to escape the cold themselves. In wealthier districts, beggars were shooed away by police, their presence deemed unsightly. In poorer quarters, they blended into the mass of misery. The fog provided cover for crime. Thieves slipped unseen through the haze, snatching purses or food and vanishing before their victims could cry out. Gangs of boys darted between carts, cutting straps, stealing coal or grabbing apples from stalls. Survival blurred the line between honesty and desperation. Yet the streets were also places of community. Neighbors gathered around vendors' fires to share warmth. Laborers exchanged scraps of bread. Children huddled together, laughing even as they shivered. In the midst of suffering, small sparks of solidarity flickered. Still, winter made every step treacherous. A slip on ice could mean a broken limb, and for a laborer, the loss of livelihood. A child barefoot in slush risked frostbite, while mothers dragged themselves through sleet, balancing baskets as the wind cut their faces. The streets of winter were not just paths of movement. They were battlefields, where every coin, every step, every breath was won against the merciless cold. Fire, light, and festivity. In a city so often smothered by fog and frost, Fire and light were not merely comforts, they were symbols of survival. Yet in Victorian London, how one experienced these essentials depended entirely on wealth. For some, winter evenings glowed with warmth and festivity. For others, they were long hours of darkness pierced only by hunger and despair. In the homes of the wealthy, fire was a constant companion. Great coal grates roared in parlours, their heat shimmering on polished furniture and velvet curtains. Candlelight flickered from chandeliers, and gas lamps hissed along corridors, turning night into a golden glow. Winter evenings became occasions for entertainment. Families gathered around pianos, guests sipped mulled wine, and children pressed close to the fire as snow fell gently beyond frosted glass. For the rich, winter was framed in warmth and light, its harshness held firmly outside. Even the poorest could not entirely escape the lure of light. Street vendors roasted chestnuts in iron braziers, their fires glowing red against the fog. Families crowded around these makeshift hearths, buying a penny's worth of warmth with each cone of chestnuts. The smell of roasted nuts mingled with coal smoke, offering a small comfort to those with empty bellies. But in the slums, fire was rare and precious. Families rationed coal carefully, sometimes lighting a single flame at night, more for morale than for warmth. Children huddled around candles, their shadows dancing on damp walls. When no coal could be afforded, the dark pressed close, swallowing voices and hope alike. Entire nights passed in near silence, families wrapped in rags waiting for dawn. Festivity, too, revealed the gulf between rich and poor. For the upper classes, Christmas was a season of opulence. Dining rooms filled with roasted geese, plum puddings, and fine wines. Parlours echoed with carols, and decorated trees sparkled with candles and ornaments imported from Germany. Gifts overflowed from stockings, dolls, books, sweets. It was a celebration of abundance, made brighter by the contrast with the dreary streets outside. Among the poor, Christmas was often little more than another cold day. Yet they found ways to mark it. A rare slice of meat, a shared loaf of sweetened bread, or the gift of a single orange became treasures. Churches and charities sometimes provided soup, coal, or small toys for children, turning despair briefly into joy. Even in rags, children sang carols in the streets, their thin voices rising through the fog, carrying a fragile cheer. Light was hope, and fire was survival. Where they burned bright, laughter followed. Where they were absent, silence ruled. In winter, Victorian London was not one city but two, one glowing with abundance, the other shrouded in darkness. Death and memory in winter in Victorian London always exacted its toll. No matter how fiercely people fought against hunger, cold, or disease, death walked hand in hand with the frost. The season revealed the city's fragility most starkly in its graveyards, where freshly dug earth stood out dark against the snow. The poor died most often and most quietly. Infants slipped away in their mothers' arms, their breath fading as frost crept across windows. Children succumbed to pneumonia, their small bodies unable to fight. Labourers collapsed in streets, frozen after long days of work without food. The homeless stiffened in alleys, discovered at dawn by policemen who carried them away in silence. Death certificates spoke of exposure, consumption, or fever, but poverty was always the unspoken cause. For the wealthy, death was rare and wrapped in ritual. Illness might strike, but warm homes, doctors, and proper diets saved many. When death did come, funerals were grand affairs. Carriages draped in black, mourners dressed in fine clothes, graves marked by stone and flowers. Memory was preserved with dignity. For the poor, death was stripped of ceremony. Coffins were plain if they could be afforded at all. Bodies were sometimes buried in communal pits, dozens laid together in unmarked graves. Families often lacked the money to bury their dead promptly, leaving them in their homes until enough coins were gathered. Grief mingled with shame, for society judged even in death. And yet death in winter carried a strange unity. Rich and poor alike felt its presence, though unequally. The wealthy mourned behind velvet curtains, while the poor wept in drafty tenements. The season reminded all that mortality was inescapable, though poverty determined its swiftness. Memory, however, did not belong only to the dead. Survivors carried winter's scars long after spring arrived. Mothers remembered children lost to fever. Fathers recalled nights spent without fire. Children who survived carried into adulthood the memory of hunger and frost. These experiences shaped lives, decisions, and even politics. Reformers pointed to winter's toll as proof of the need for change. better housing, improved sanitation, and more humane laws. Winter, then, was not merely a season of suffering. It was a mirror that exposed the inequalities of Victorian London. It revealed who thrived and who perished, who feasted and who starved. It showed the strength of communities who shared scraps and the cruelty of systems that forced families apart. And it reminded the city, year after year, that survival was not guaranteed. When spring finally returned, its warmth felt like resurrection. Streets thawed, fog lifted, and markets filled again with food. Yet the memory of winter lingered. For those who had endured, survival itself became a quiet triumph. For those who had lost, the season remained a wound. In the end, winter in Victorian London was not just cold weather. It was a test of endurance, a stage upon which the drama of inequality, resilience, and survival played out. Some emerged from it stronger. Others never emerged at all.